So thank you for joining. I want this to be super interactive. So if anyone has questions as this goes on, please interrupt and let me know. But the general kind of title of my talk is Networking in Academia and Industry. I'm currently the portfolio manager at Orionis, and I can explain a little bit about what I do there, but generally wanted to kind of kick it off by talking you through a little bit like what my background is and all the ways that networking was really, really important for some of the positions that I got offered and how my career actually moved forward. So to start off with, I just wanted to go through, my undergrad was in biochemistry and immunology. My master's was in immunology of infectious diseases, and then my PhD was in immunology. And then I moved on and I did a postdoc in Boston. After that position, I started working for a startup. I was the 9th employee called Seed Health, and I was the director of research and development there before moving on about a year ago to the current position that I have. And so I would love to say that my path was linear, but I actually had no idea what I was going to do next in each of these positions. I know that this is mainly a graduate audience, and so most of you are probably at this point here. But even one thing that I did want to share is that pretty much right after my PhD, so even getting my PhD, and I'll explain why, was due to networking a little bit, and then also the director of R&D position definitely was, and so was my current role. And so one thing that I did know was that as I was going through grad school and I was thinking about leaving, I started to think about the kind of positions that I wanted to do after. And to be honest, I had zero clue. And so I started by thinking about, well, what is it that I enjoy about science and what is it that I've had absolutely enough of? And for me at that point, I was done with bench work after my postdoc. I loved the conceptual building. I loved the lab meetings, but in terms of the actual bench work, it wasn't for me, and people are different. And so I knew that I wanted to transition over to industry, but the types of roles that I wanted weren't necessarily at the bench. And so that's where my journey started. And I spent the last 2 years of my postdoc. It was a pretty long postdoc. It was 6 years. And I spent the last 2 years of my postdoc really trying to expand out my network and talking to as many people as possible. And so I'll show you a little bit how I did that. It kind of came down ultimately to 3 different things. So the networking tools that I used, number one was access to professionals while I was in graduate school. So, and I'll dig into what I mean by that, but generally professors or mentors that you have access to in graduate school and also in postdoc. I used LinkedIn really heavily. And the third tool that I really leaned on was informational interviews. And so I'll break out these 3 and show you what I did. So to start off with, talking about the access that you have in graduate school. So I just want to tell a quick story here. So during my undergraduate degree, and I know that some of you are past that, but during my undergraduate degree, I ended up doing my undergraduate thesis on lupus. And so I did a review on lupus. I went through the literature to understand lupus as a disease. And there was one name that kept springing out as I was putting together the literature search. And that was David Eisenberg, who at the time was in London. He was kind of known as the godfather of lupus. He helped describe it in the 1950s, but he's an author on a lot of papers as I was working through the review. And about 2 weeks before I graduated from undergrad, I saw a poster in my department that he was actually coming in to talk, to give like a Wednesday evening talk. So I went to the talk. It was very packed out. And generally, I don't ask questions at all, like when the room is that big because of imposter syndrome and thinking that, questions aren't valuable. But I did actually ask him a question. I put my hand up in the Q&A session and I just asked him why it was that lupus affected women more than it affected men. After the talk, I went down to speak to him and he actually cut the line and handed me his card. And he's like, I'm looking for a summer student to address that question. If you have any interest, please reach out. And so I ended up doing my summer placement in his lab and ultimately applied for a PhD in lupus. And I did my PhD within that division. But like the gateway in was him giving that talk. And I kicked myself, right? Because at that point it was the end of my undergraduate degree. And I'd had 3 years or 4 years of exposure to these amazing people that I didn't realize were as accessible as they were. So that was something that I took with me into my graduate program. Whenever we had anybody cool coming in to speak to the department and I was interested in what they did, I tried to linger around afterwards, talk to them, build a connection, add them on LinkedIn, just because it helped me, even just asking them, well, what is your job right now and how did you get to becoming a professor, helped me work out a little bit that that's not what I wanted to do. So the parts of their jobs that I liked and the parts that I didn't like. And so while you're in graduate school, I would say that it's important to reach out to your professors because, you know, the university does the hard work and kind of puts these people on your plate, and then the rest is up to you. So your professors, whether those are your PIs directly or just general professors in your department that you work with, are a valuable resource, not because they themselves can shed light on the skills and industry experience they have, but they probably also have connections from people that they've worked with in the past. And so a lot of them are actually industry experts themselves. So if you're thinking of moving over into industry, it would be good to get their feedback and say, well, you know, I'm thinking of moving over into a company. I don't know whether academia is for me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your thoughts are about it? And one thing that I would say that at this point, while you're data gathering, just keep in mind that people have different paths, that some people can be pushier about their path and they can say to you, go and do this because I did this, but just write the notes and then you can go away afterwards and work out whether that path is for you. But in general, talking to as many people as possible can only help you work out what it is you want to do and what you don't want to do. And one more kind of actionable thing that you can do is reach out, get to know them beyond the classroom if you're at the beginning of graduate school, but if you're towards the end of your PhD, ask them for like office hours or an informal coffee chat, like, can I grab a coffee with you? And I'll give you an example of an email that you could send that would be helpful. Another thing that's important is actually to dedicate time to do your research a little bit in terms of, you know, the types of people that are coming in, like what talks are being invited weekly into your department, who's coming up that you would perhaps want to speak to and learn a little bit more about. And so those who may not otherwise consider speaking with you if you were already a peer or in the workforce, they might be more likely to do that while you're still in the learning phase of your professional career. So you saying and being honest, I don't know what I want to do next. However, I'm interested in these specific specialties, or I'm interested in these companies, to just kind of target the conversation a little bit more. You'll find that there are a lot of people who are open to speaking to you about what their experiences are and what their thoughts are. And so take advantage of this fruitful time and connect with as many people as you can in the most impactful way possible. And when I say impactful way, I mean, before you kind of speak to people, just make sure that you've done the research and what their past is, you know, like make sure you've looked online, what they've worked on in the past, what their papers are, if there are any companies that they've worked with that you perhaps just want to learn more about, but just really don't just show up and you know, see how the conversation goes. Really make sure that you've written out notes to target the conversation a bit more. And so some extra tips here. Attend the events. I know that when you're in graduate school or even when you're doing a postdoc, you can get pummeled with brochures that say this person is coming to speak, or, you know, there's this event that's happening on a Tuesday evening or whatever. And you know, you'll read the title and you'll say, well, this isn't really relevant to me, or I don't want to go. If you can go, I would say to still go, because you just never really know, right? Like who's going to be speaking. It might not actually be about the topic itself and the topic of the talk, but more about the people that you have access to while you're at those events. And so it's just always worth signing up and learning as much as you can. Another thing, which I know a few of my friends found a little bit intense, but I was actually advised to do by a mentor, was to keep an Excel doc. And I kept a running Excel doc of people that I spoke to, talks that I attended, and just a couple of notes, just to make sure that I wasn't repeating conversations. Also, just to keep track a little bit of the kind of positions that I had exposed myself to. And it helped me see where there were gaps. So for example, at one point, I'd realized that I hadn't really spoken to a lot of policy people, and maybe I would be interested in a job at some point in, doing policy work. And so that was something that I then dedicated a few weeks to really try to expand. And the last thing here is to just be as helpful as you can to others. And so if you're having a conversation with a friend who is, saying to you, I'm interested in a job at GSK or something, if there's anyone you've spoken to at GSK, you could always reach out and see whether you could help connect that person. Because my general experience is, while you're in this networking world, what goes around comes around a little bit. And just like the more helpful you are to others, the more that people will keep you in mind if opportunities come their way that might be helpful to you. And so that's the kind of last tip that I would give here in terms of accessing graduate school. So the other tool that I used really, really heavily actually was LinkedIn. I think it's amazing because it doesn't actually have the obligation of having, to upload photos and tidbits about yourself daily. It's just, you just have to keep your profile up to date. And so much of networking is done right now online, which kind of levels the playing field in terms of on-ground and online learners. So I'll give you an example here. Pre-pandemic, I would say that it's important when you're trying to set up interviews with people or speak to people, it would have to be in person, which is they connect you to their secretary to try to find 15 minutes. It's all complicated. Whereas now so much is done on Zoom that it's easier to schedule 15 minutes here and there to grab a coffee with someone over Zoom and get to know them. And so your professional network in general can help you find a job and unlock opportunities. So it's really important to foster those. And just as you would in person, just make sure that you put your best and most professional foot forward when making virtual connections. I would add here that the word professional means different things to different people. And so postgraduate school, some people decide to pivot and go into the arts, for example. Some people, decide to stay in biotech or go into old, pharma, which has a more old school culture. So I would say in terms of what professional means, it's just, what is it that you want, the message that you want to send out about yourself and about what you want to do. And so whether that's an artsy photo, right? If you decide that you want to go into doing more social media, science comms, etc., or whether that's you want to, just put some thought into how you want your LinkedIn profile and who it is that you want to appeal to with it. And so just make sure that you maintain it. Again, tasteful photo means different things to different people, and it depends on what career you want to go into, but just put some thought into it, I would say is important. And then another thing is that when you're early in your career, just have a really good personal summary. And that's something that I'll actually circle back to, what I mean by personal summary. And then obviously an overview of your skills and your experience. And so a few things that you can do with LinkedIn is connect with people that you know, reconnect with contacts that you may have lost touch with. So that's old professors or mentors that you've worked with in the past. You could share your insights and stories by posting, but the main thing that I think is great is that you can actually ask your network for help. So there is zero shame in posting something saying, hey, I'm looking for contacts in, biotech or in XXX. Does anybody know anyone that they can put me in touch with? That's something that you regularly see on LinkedIn, and that's why people are on it. And so just a personal story here about LinkedIn is that LinkedIn was actually the way that I ended up getting my position at Seed as Director of Research and Development. So when I started networking, it was about 2 years at that point where I'd spoken to a lot of people in Boston. I'd spoken to people a little bit, like friends' parents, for example. I was really, spending probably a few hours a week, really dedicating it to working out what I wanted to do next. And because I knew I wanted to move more into kind of the business development side of science, there were a lot of people that I spoke to who were saying things to me like, go do an MBA, you have to do an MBA, or go do management consulting, you have to go do management consulting. There's no other route into business development than doing these two things. But I started to speak to people who had slightly, irregular paths into those positions. And a lot of those people were saying to me, there's no one size fits all approach to how you can get those roles. You can get those roles with experience. You just have to prove that you have the experience. But essentially, postgraduate school, remember that you can't teach a business person to read a paper and digest it and extract meaningful information from it. However, you can teach Excel docs or an MBA to anyone who's been to graduate school, right? So they were like, you already have the skill set part that's hard. But in terms of this stuff, it's learnable. So it just depends on like how you want to learn it. And for me, I just knew I didn't want to get myself into debt and do an MBA. That might be more of an option for other people in terms of scholarships, etc. But for me, it wasn't. And then management consulting, it just felt like whenever I spoke to people at BCG or McKinsey or etc., they always spoke about it as a means to an end. So they would say, well, I did this to then get this position, right? And for me, my postdoc was a means to an end. I mean, 6 years, I was totally done by the end of it. And so given that it was like, I just, for me, did not want to go into another role that was a means to an end for me. So I was like, no, let me see if I can collect experience during the next 2 years before I transition out. And so I actually used LinkedIn to get a lot of consulting positions. So I started emailing people that I knew or I'd spoken to, and I'd say to them, this is my expertise. Does your startup need any support? Maybe 7 hours a week. I calculated that 7 hours was the maximum amount of time that I could give an extracurricular activity, because if I was really busy in the lab during the week, that's a Sunday. And so I calculated 7, and then that even allowed me to split out that 7 to 2 consulting gigs if they were 3.5 hours each. And so I used LinkedIn to reach out to startups that had co-founders that were working in the food allergy immunology space, which is what I was doing. And I just would reach out and I'd say to them, hi, do you want to grab a coffee? And then when we'd get that coffee, I'd say to them, are you looking for any support? And like, can we talk about it? Because I'm trying to gather experience in the next 2 years. And so any exposure to like operational experience in a startup would be really helpful for me. And so I used LinkedIn to get those, to get some of those positions that that ended up helping me get my next job. But most importantly, at that point, after 2 years of networking, when Seed Health launched, and it was a microbiome company that was interested in doing stuff in the allergy space from an immunology perspective, so a very good fit for me, I started to get messages from people that I'd spoken to who would say to me, hey, have you heard of this company Seed that just launched? Have you heard of this company? I think that they're trying to recruit a chief scientist. Maybe it's something you're interested in. And so I went on LinkedIn and I stalked the co-founders, and I left the whole see who looked at your profile thing on. I just had it on at the time. I stalked both of them. I went to bed, and when I woke up the next morning, I had a message from one of them saying, hey, we've checked out your profile. We actually think you might be a good fit for a role we're trying to hire for. Do you have time to jump on a call? We got on a call, and then we started, chatting. We had probably about 3 or 4 meetings before they offered me a consulting position during my postdoc for 2 months. And after my postdoc was up, I transitioned into a full-time role as director. And that time consulting allowed me to gauge whether I could work with this team, whether I liked the work that they were doing, because there were some consulting jobs I did that just, it was clear to me that like the team wasn't a good fit, or the work itself just wasn't what I was looking for. It wouldn't have made me happy. Whereas by consulting with Seed, it helped me really, really see that like, okay, I can work with this team, and this is actually the type of role that I'm looking for. And so that was all due to LinkedIn. And so really, really important, again, to keep it up to date and use it as much as you can. I put a special mention here to Science Twitter, because I think it's amazing in terms of keeping up with research as it goes out, and just also keeping up to date with some of the conversations that are going on in your own field. I find it really cool, actually, that there are a lot of high profile professors that will debate nuance on Twitter, and it just helps you see just the kind of conversations that are being had in your field and what's most relevant for like industry, for example. Like I feel like I learned a lot about drug development, so like manufacturing vaccines, just from being on Science Twitter and seeing the conversation that went on around COVID. It just like helped me really hone in where I wanted to learn more. And so special mention to Science Twitter for that reason. I'd also say that currently it's very cool that Science Twitter is using to recruit. So there's a lot of labs actually that are posting postdoc positions. But there are also like venture capital funds that I've seen post positions, like looking for a graduate student that, and so just keeping up to date and just like swiping through it for a few minutes every morning will just, during this time of like looking for a position, help you see what's available out there. So the last thing that I think I've alluded to a little bit during this talk, out of those 3 things, is informational interviews, which I think are so important. And I was lucky early on to have a mentor that really talked me through what I should be doing. Because when I started having informational interviews with people, some of them were a bit embarrassing when I look back now. Like I had no idea what I was doing and I was just showing up for a coffee and didn't, I was just like, let's have a chat. But they actually have to be a little bit more intentional than that, because you just want to make sure that that person doesn't feel like you're wasting their time and you're using that time to the best of your ability. And so an informational interview is an informal conversation that you can have with someone who works in an area of interest to you. So it's a really effective research tool, and it's best done after you've done some kind of online research about the person, as I mentioned earlier. It's not a job interview, but it's still important to put your best foot forward. And the objective isn't to find job openings. I think that some people will go into informational interviews, and they'll go into them because they're interested in mentoring. And so you don't need to be as explicit as to say, do you have any job openings? Because if they did, you would have done research and looked online. And so you may feel awkward reaching out to people you don't know. However, most people really enjoy taking a few moments out of their day to reflect on their professional life and give advice to someone with interest in their field. And so I think to be completely direct, I think the majority of people really enjoy talking about themselves. And so if you just sit in front of them and you just say to them, can you just tell me a little bit more about the job that you have right now, what that looks like to you day to day and how you got there? It might help you understand a little bit what other people's paths look like. And so the 6 steps of informational interviewing are to research different career fields and see who it is that you might want to speak to. But also you might not know that you don't want to do a job until you speak to somebody. And so I would say be open-minded, because I still did a lot of informational interviews with management consultants, even though I was becoming clear to me that it wasn't a job that would have been a good fit for me. Identify people to interview, put them on your Excel, in your Excel doc. Use LinkedIn to get to those people. If there are people that you're like, this person seems amazing and I want their job, or I want to be them. There are a couple of people that I would see and be like, okay, I want your job in 30 years. I would then go on LinkedIn and see if I knew anyone who was connected to them and I would send a message and just say, hey, do you know this person well? Would you feel comfortable connecting me with them? And there were a lot of people, I barely got no's, that would just say, yeah, sure, happy to do that if they knew the person well. Make sure that you prepare for the interview once it's set. And so develop a brief introduction of who you are, what you're working on, and what you're hoping to achieve from the meeting. So be very clear and just say, I've followed you for a little while. I just want to understand a little bit more about what your job is. I think I'm interested in these fields. So don't leave it too open-ended and say, well, I have no idea what I want to do, and I'm hoping that you'll help me work that out. Just say, I'm interested in these specific fields, but I'm not entirely sure what roles are a good fit for me. Initiate contact and then conduct the informational interview. So have it. The other thing that I think is really underestimated is the importance of follow-up. After you have the informational interview, I would always follow up and just shoot an email over. If you were writing notes during the informational interview, which I like to do, I would always follow up and say, here's that paper we discussed. This is the person I mentioned who works on this. Do you mind connecting me to these 3 people you mentioned? Because sometimes people will throw out flippantly, oh, I should connect you to this person. They work in this. And so, but make sure you write down what those names are, and then you follow up and you say, hey, not sure if the spelling's right, but you said you'd connect me to this person. Are you still happy to do that? And when you follow up, it just really solidifies you to that person, because if they're speaking to a lot of people, then, it just helps you stand out a little bit. But I would always follow up with them. And then if any of the people they connected you with or any of the follow-ups ended up moving forward, I would always loop around and just be, show gratitude and just say, by the way, quick update, ended up, working with this person, or it was a really good talk. Thank you so much for connecting me. And so, don't underestimate following up and how important it is. And so the final kind of helpful tip that one person who was a mentor to me also told me to do actually was to write a short paragraph of my narrative and update that over time. And so you write out a couple of sentences about who you are. So for me, I, worked on it a little bit, but originally it was, postdoc working on food allergies and the microbiome, background in autoimmunity, T-cell focused, like these buzzwords. And it was like 3 lines, looking for position in venture capital, for example, in like these specific roles. You keep it short. And what you find is that if you repeat these things over and over again to people when you're at networking events or when you're emailing them, then you become that guy. So meaning that, for example, when Seed was looking for a scientist, and they were saying to people, do you know anyone with, a PhD who works in allergies microbiome? Then it became, like me repeating it so much, it became then like 2 or 3 people were like, actually, yeah, we do know one person and she is looking for a position. And so that's what helped, when I said that people were asking me, have you heard of this company? They're looking for this. That was because I'd repeated that narrative so many times to those people that it just like really solidified. And so that was something at the very beginning of my journey that one of my mentors told me to do, because he said, it would be helpful for people to just have 3 very brief lines on who you are and what you do. And also run it by people, send it out to people just to make sure, like I'd say it to friends, like an elevator pitch, and just be like, how does this sound? And, if people are honest and they're like kind of boring, I don't know what systemic lupus is. So then I took that out and just put lupus, like getting a bits of advice from family and friends and just like repeating it over and over again helps with networking. And so the last thing, actually, I keep saying the last thing, there are a couple more things that I wanted to put up was just an example of an email. If there's somebody that you've identified that you want to reach out to or get in touch with, whether that's through LinkedIn or whether that's sending them an email itself. So looking online for their email if they haven't responded on LinkedIn and trying that way. Keep it really, really brief is the advice that I would give. I mean, as brief as you can keep it, like a couple of sentences. Definitely put a space between your words, which I didn't do here, by the way, but just say, I'm a PhD student studying this at this, and I came across you. Definitely put a sentence that's flattering. So like, I came across you while reading this, watching this, or attending this talk, or like read your paper, and I was inspired by the work you're doing, particularly. And if you could put something that's like technically detailed, I think that like that level of flattery indicates to that person that you've really put the effort in. So for example, if they have a paper that you've read that you really, really liked, being like, I was really fascinated by this specific mechanism that you were working on. Like you could go into that amount of detail if they're technical experts. And it just, shows that you know what you're talking about and that you're focused. Then just saying, do you have 10 to 15 minutes available to connect by person or by phone or in person, so I could introduce myself and learn more about, again, whatever it is that their technical expertise is. Thanks, and look forward to hearing from you. Keep it really brief, because they're just gonna get a lot of emails, they're gonna skim read. And honestly, like I've very rarely encountered people that did not respond. Even I definitely had a couple of people who responded and said, hey, I don't have any time. What is it that you're looking for? And then I'd have to respond with what I was looking for. And then they would connect me to someone, for example. But I never had anybody who just outright ignored the email. So I think that, keep it brief, be flattering, and just be clear about what it is that you're looking for. And so just remember that networking is a skill. It's not, I don't think it's comfortable for the majority of people. And so it is a skill that you acquire over time. I mean, at the beginning, when I started trying to explore about what it is that I wanted to do next, and when I was really leaning into networking, it was so uncomfortable for me at the beginning doing informational interviews, but also I just felt like I wasn't prepared for the interviewing process in general when it came to job interviewing. That one other mentor that I had said to me, just start applying for jobs and interviewing as practice. So that's something that I started doing. I was applying for even like private equity jobs that like for me weren't something that I wanted to do, but they were looking for a background that I had. And so I just applied for the positions and I did a few interviews. Some of them in hindsight, again, were awful. Like when I think back, I had no idea what the job was. I was not prepared, but it just helped me get more and more comfortable, like sitting in front of strangers and like, selling myself. And especially being in a lab for such a long period of time, like you're not used to being in that position where you have to sell yourself. And so just like starting to do it can help you get comfortable. And so remembering that it's a skill that, will improve over time, recognizing where you can improve like any other skill set. So is it that you feel uncomfortable talking? Is it the selling yourself, which part of it is that you don't like? Is it the being able to talk about yourself? Because then you can practice talking about yourself to friends and family and to the people around you, and running it by mentors. That might help you get better at it. So break it apart. So to master it, deconstruct it into more manageable parts. So break out the networking, whether that's LinkedIn, informational interviews, the emailing, just break out what it is that you want to tackle one at a time. And that's where, again, like the Excel doc for me really, really helped track that and track who I'd spoken to and how much effort I'd put into it. Commit some regular time to it. And so even if that's an hour a week where you're just scrolling through LinkedIn, looking through people and their jobs, or whether you're looking at what jobs are available, dedicate some regular time to it and focus time to it. Find a support system. This one's really important. One of my friends who was doing an MBA at the time used to call it building your personal board of directors. So people, it's very businessy, but she was like, whether that's friends, family, your mom, like building a group of people that like what to lead, like who to ask for what, right? To lean into, whether that's, like I was sitting in an informational interview and I started breaking out into sweats and like I forgot my train of thought, and just having people that can help you like manage like self-relationship as well as like external relationships, I think is really important. And when it comes to building that group of mentors, follow up with them regularly. Again, try to be as helpful as you can to them. Check in with them by email, but make sure that you maintain the relationship so you're not calling on them once every couple of years, only when you need them. Be deliberate, as we discussed earlier, in emails and in informational interviews. Visualize success. So try to remain optimistic, because it is hard. It's not easy. And it can be really unnerving to, like I had informational interviews with people that were like, I don't think you know what you're doing. Like, as in like, I think you should stay on that bench. That's the best route for you. And then I get really frustrated. I'm like, but I know that's not what I want to do. That's not my path. And so just, try to visualize success, remain optimistic, but also, again, when you're speaking to people, to zoom out, to lean back and be like, well, that was their journey and my journey might overlap a little bit, but it doesn't mean I need to take verbatim everything that they're telling me to do. Challenge yourself. So remember that the trope, being uncomfortable is good. It means that you're learning. And then the last thing here is get a coach if you're really struggling with it. So, there are people out there. I know that there are lots of universities that in their career departments have coaches that they work with. But these are people that are used to working professionally and helping people network more and find a career. So that's something that I would say, lean into, reach out to your university and see if there are people like that available for you to use and lean into. So finally, any questions that any of you have for me? Thank you for listening.
When it came to you starting to network and such, how did you deal, one, did you have imposter syndrome going into like networking? And two, if you did, how did you deal with it? Because I noticed that for myself, that's where I really struggle. Like I know that I need to network, but it's like the imposter syndrome of like me going into the workforce and like not feeling prepared makes me very reluctant, and I end up procrastinating on actually doing what I need to do.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So imposter syndrome is a beast, but I also think that it's a beast that's everybody who's in academia carries it as a weight, because when you're in academia, right, when you're in graduate school, you know that if you throw a rock at any institution, you'll probably hit someone who's way smarter than you, right? Like that was something that I'm like, there are so many smart people here, like I'm definitely not the smartest person within a 1 mile radius. And so it's normal to have, but I will tell you that when you leave academia is when it starts to get better, because you realize, or I mean, not necessarily if you want to leave academia, but when you do start to speak to people outside of academia, you realize that technical expertise is really rare, that you actually are one of the few people in the world that have mastered the thing that you're working on or have spent that much time working on that. And there is something that you can offer to the world. And it's something that other people, you know, I'm sure even now when you talk about what you're doing in grad school, you have friends outside of grad school that are like, you know, mind blown, what are you working on? So it's when you start to like move away from academia or like speak to people outside of it, that you start to realize, actually, I do have a skill set. And that's for me where informational interviews were really powerful, because even when I would speak to people in biotech, so people who had a scientific background, they would say to me, oh, immunologists are really needed right now. Like most companies lack immunologists. They can't find ones, especially ones that work on XX. And so it helped me kind of pull myself out of that. But I guess in answer to your question, like imposter syndrome is totally normal. A little bit of it is healthy, a tiny bit of it. Obviously, if there's so much of it that you feel crippled and by like any form of action, then I would say talk to somebody about it. But in general, just remember that like most people after grad school carry it as a really, really heavy weight, and it does get better. It does get better as you speak to people and you start to like really hone in your story, right? I hate to use the word brand, but it is kind of like that. Like as you start to realize as you're moving into positions, what your power is and what your technical expertise is and how to tell your story in a way that really empowers you, like those 3 sentences, that is what forms your niche. And that's when you'll be like, okay, yeah, I definitely have a skill set here that most people don't, and experience that most people don't have. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much. This is really helpful. I think I'm a 4th-year graduate student and kind of trying to be, I think, where you were at, like at the end of the 2 years, towards the end of your postdoc. But specifically, I'm kind of in a very specialized field, I think, like in magnetic resonance. And so I'm trying to decide, do I want to pivot out of that like very narrow area where I don't see, you know, a lot of opportunities beyond like, you know, working for a pharmaceutical company and just reporting spectra and doing the analysis, which is not something that I want. And so maybe can you talk a little bit about the specifics behind how you pivoted from bench science to where you are now, and like what specific skills you tried to focus on in that pivot, and whether or not like, because I think what I'm trying to decide is, do I need to do a postdoc in a more commercially like marketable scientific role to have that technical experience that's more marketable than maybe what I'm at right now.
What did you say your specialty was?
It's like I work in a much more smaller scale version of magnetic resonance imaging. And so, but I think I have a very, very broad skill set where I do a lot of hardware development. And specifically right now I work on laser micromachining. But I have a physical chemistry background. And so I don't really see that area as like a directly, with a direct translation to a lot of industry jobs.
So this was actually part of the original conversation that, you know, when I said I spoke to a mentor who said to write out the 3-sentence brand thing, that was because I couldn't work out, when I was talking to this mentor, I couldn't work out whether I was covering everything that I wanted to in those 3 sentences. But okay, so to go back a little bit. So your direct graduate school title or your thesis title doesn't actually matter, because what you've learned in graduate school is to pose a question, answer it, how to have controls, how to like write a publication, how to submit a publication, how to like receive peer-reviewed feedback, the importance of it. These are all of the skills actually that the external world wants, right? They don't actually care about, I mean, now I work in cancer, my background was in lupus, and it's, you know, I still do stuff that is related to my PhD, but the important bit actually isn't the technical detail, it's more the broad skills that I mentioned. And so I think that where it was most relevant was when I started the position at Seed, when I was director of R&D, and when you join a startup that's that early, you need to be like, wear a lot of hats and a jack of all trades. And that's really when you start to realize how much in graduate school, like how many skills you learn in graduate school that most people want or need. So, you know, like how to be resourceful, like, again, how to answer questions, even when it comes down to when you're meeting with the FDA and they're looking for certain things, and like how to write, you know, write a paper or write a protocol, that stuff that you learn in the lab. And so, yeah, it's all about writing out all of the skills that you've learned, as many as you can list. Another thing that you can do is, like, when you go into your informational interviews, you can ask the people, if you know there's you're getting along, it seems like there's a mentor relationship they're developing, ask them and say, but like, me explaining to you what I do, where is it that you see the most amount of value, right? Just ask them, and they might actually say something random like, people are looking for your expertise in this venture capital fund who are like trying to invest in, you know, these machines, and then they need a technical expert to help them work out the difference, right? Or it could be something way more broad where they're like, actually, this is the value that I see in the experience that you've had. And it might be something that you hadn't realized before. But yeah, I think that mentor, actually, like looping back to that, said to me, your story isn't boring, you're just not telling it the right way. Like, this is the number one problem with, like, in general, branding and storytelling. It's like working out how to tell your story by repeating it over and over again for those 2 years, and really, like, you know, shaving away parts of it. Like, there were some moments where I'd be at networking events repeating my spiel, and I could see some people were like dead behind the eyes or phasing out, and I'm like, yeah, okay, I need to read. Like, and then I get bored, and I'm like, they're clearly really bored by what I'm saying, so I need to go back to the drawing board here and work on this sentence because it's not working. And there's a part of me that still feels uncomfortable saying all of this, because we're not taught to be this way in academia, like, at all. You're not taught, you're not supposed to sell yourself. You're supposed to look for the holes. Like, as a scientist, your job is to like pick out holes in like everything that you want to do and focus on those, as opposed to like focusing on the positive all the time. But there's a middle ground here that's healthy. And as you start to talk to more people during the remainder of graduate school, you'll see that, and you'll see, like, that's why I think talking to people is the best thing that you can do, because it'll only teach you a lot about like what you don't want, what you want, but also like how to tell your own story and the parts that people are really interested in that you should like really let shine.
Thank you. I have a question also. Thank you for your presentation. I have questions related to LinkedIn page. What is the best way for organizing data? For example, for the about part, I see many people too long about related to their skills, or they put bullet point for their skill set. Do you think is that useful or not? And the other question is that I see many people who post for thank you for just offering me this co-op position, or for example, a post for their paper that is accepted. Do you think, and sometimes I think it's become really annoying. I don't know how it is useful or it's not.
So as in like how it's useful when people post posters or research that they're doing?
Posting paper, posting thank you notes, being so specific in designing the LinkedIn page, like about the skill set. Do you think to what extent it is useful and it can have a positive impact?
Yeah.
What extent it can be annoying for others?
Yeah. So I would say that like there's middle ground. If you think about it, your LinkedIn is going to be helpful because if you apply for a job, right? Or if anyone wants to look you up, they're going to go to your LinkedIn page and they're going to skim through. No, I'm not convinced that anyone's spending more than a few seconds on anyone's LinkedIn page, right? Like they're clicking on it, they're going through and they're seeing the relevant bits. And so when you're designing your LinkedIn page, think about, not that anyone's doing this, but like, are they going to be interested in the gymnastics award you won when you were 16, given the jobs that you're applying for? Probably not, right? Like, but if you've decided that you want to go into gymnastics psychoms, that might be a helpful thing to put on your profile. So I think that like LinkedIn can update over time. I think just always try to think from the lens of like, if I was this company and I'm going to look at your LinkedIn, what is it that I'm going to be interested in? In terms of posting posters or research that you're doing, that is helpful because if I'm trying to think like if in our company we were interested in hiring somebody and we were interested in somebody who had B cell expertise, if I went to their LinkedIn page and I saw their research stack, that would make my life easy because I could see all the B cell papers that they have listed and like clear. It saves me having to like dig through the resume. So I would say just make sure that your LinkedIn is accurate and it holds information that is actually valuable for somebody who is going to be checking you out. Like, what would you want to see? Like, what would you want to see from a research assistant, right? Like that's applying to work with you. What is it that you want to see on that LinkedIn page? Like for anybody that you want to work with, and just like keep it focused on that lens of what the other person is looking for.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. So when you were still in grad school and initially starting setting up informational interviews, how did you choose who to ask for an interview?
To be honest, I started by being like anyone and everyone, because I made a list of like all of the potential jobs I could do. Stay in academia, professor route, right? Which I started to talk to my professor about. That was a whole different story. And I was like, is this something that I want to do? Given I was done with bench work, I don't think that was a very obvious option for me. And so then next I started to explore, what do I want to do? What is it that people, when I go on LinkedIn and I look at people who went to my uni who also got a PhD, what jobs did they go on to? And I was just shamelessly stalking people on LinkedIn. It's like going through like pages, like spending an hour every week being like, what's this person's job? What is it that they do every day? And if it was someone I was interested in, I would DM them and I would say, hey, do you have a couple of minutes to chat to me on the phone? But you still have to flatter. So you still have to do research a little bit to see what they're working on, because otherwise it's a bit rude to just be like, I want to pick your brain. A lot of people don't like that. I've seen a lot of like people actually post on LinkedIn that they really dislike it when people are like, hey, do you have any time for me to pick your brain? Because it just feels vague and unspecific. Yeah. And so it's better to just be like, I want to speak to you for this very specific reason. But that's how I started, was just like shamelessly stalking people on LinkedIn, looking at talks. If I went to talks where I saw people that were really cool, I was like, would go down and speak to them. And I'm like, I just want to know what you do every day. And I honestly, this was extreme, but it was more symptomatic of where I was in my postdoc. I was going on 6 informational interviews a week at one point, like 15-minute interviews, breakfast, lunches. Sometimes I'd be like I would set them up on my calendar. And so that's why I had to track on Excel, because I didn't want to and then people were just so helpful. Like you go on one informational, they're like, I'll connect you to 3. And then it just becomes more and more branches of people. But that was how I worked out the jobs that I definitely didn't want to do. That's what it really helped me with. It helped me rule out a lot of positions. And I'm like, okay, this won't be good for me. And also, I don't think that they'll want me, that like this job thinks that I would be a good fit for them. And yeah, so that's how I started, was mainly LinkedIn and then talking to people. And then at one point I was just a bit shameless about it. Like if people were like, my dad works for GSK, I'd be like, hey, do you mind if I chat to your dad for 15 minutes? And people like really nice about it. They're like, yeah, sure. If you're polite enough. Yeah.
Thanks. And how did you use the Excel doc? Like, how did that help you?
The Excel doc, I had tabs on it. So I had like tabs of people that I spoke to, and then people that I wanted to speak to. And then on the Excel, I had like their names, the jobs they had, when I spoke to them, what we spoke about, just bullet points. Because then otherwise you'd forget. Like sometimes you might like meet people again and you forget that you spoke to them on the phone, and then it just doesn't make you look great. So like that was one of my mentors again. She told me that I should do that. She told me that I should track on an Excel. And the last thing actually that I did forget to mention in my talk, but I had a note to talk about, was that all of those informational interviews actually helped me be better at the job that I have now. So now I am the job I had at Seed. So at Seed, I was director of R&D. So I was looking after like CRO relationships, doing clinical trials, and ex vivo, in vitro acquiring of data to show that the products that we were making work, right? So like I was overseeing that, and then moved over now to this cancer company where my job is portfolio manager. So meaning that they are planning on going first dose in humans next year. And my job is to sit between the science team. So I sit in lab meetings, but also business development to map out, based on the burden of disease and the market and FDA regulation, et cetera, which diseases we should go after and when. So to make a case with our team, like of which cancers we want to go after and like how that fits with the timeline. So because my job sits between both, I often have to be really resourceful. So like, it's even small things. Like the other day we were talking to a CRO and they were like, this antibody's back ordered 2 months and we won't be able to start this experiment for 2 months. So I went on LinkedIn and I messaged a couple of people that were still that I knew that were at the institution. And I was like, can you send an aliquot over so we can just get these experiments started? And found someone who could. So it just like really helps even set me up for the position now where like regularly, like the other day, we needed a regulatory consultant. So I went on LinkedIn and I typed regulatory consultant and realized that I spoke to one while I was informational interviewing 2.5 years ago, or someone who then went on to become one. So I DM'd them and I was like, we're looking for someone, and they were like, let's jump on a call. And now we're working with them part-time. And so it just like really helps even set you up for like, because it helps you think in a very kind of resourceful mindset, if that makes sense. Makes you more comfortable with it, I guess, when you have the position to like reach out to people and kind of get stuff done.
So now that you're in the position where people would ask you for information interviews, is there something specific that you really appreciate bringing up or talking about?
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Oh, now that you're in a place where people would ask you for information on interviews, is there something you really appreciate when they talk about or a personality trait or?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I just always get impressed by people who are like very resourceful, to be honest, who actually follow up. Because I talk to a lot of people where it goes nowhere. But I mean, that's just part of their journey, right? Like by talking to me, they may have realized that my job is not for them whatsoever, and that's fine. But there are a lot of people who are like very resourceful, really follow up, will regularly check in. That was something that I did, and I always find it quite sweet when people send like end of year updates. Like there are a couple of people who will send like an email and say, hey, I just wanted to update you, like haven't started applying for jobs yet, but like my PhD is going well, like this is what I'm working on. But it just like helps, it shows that the relationship is important and that they want to maintain it. So then it makes me make more of an effort, because if I encounter like a startup that's really trying to hire somebody then like that has a similar skill set, then I just remember those people. I'm like, yeah, oh my God, I should connect you. I currently have a list of about 4 people that have reached out in the last 3 weeks that want to be connected to people that I know through LinkedIn. And so like, I'm trying to repay the favor back that people did for me when I was, informational interviewing. So yeah, I would say regular follow-up is important.
Yeah.
I guess I have another question for you. So you said when you were still in your postdoc, you kind of did like weekend consulting. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached that, how you approached like different companies, startups for that, and how you managed that with the PI you were working for?
Yeah. So the PI I was working for was very old school and absolutely could not know about it when I started. I'm just going to be honest about that. Like he would not have been, I didn't, as long as I was getting my experiments done and my research done, and to be honest, like we had to be in on Saturdays. Like it was a little bit of an intense lab, but in my head, I was like, anything that I do on a Sunday afternoon is not really any of his business as long as it doesn't get in his way. And so for the first year, I didn't say anything to him about it at all. I just didn't mention it. And so that's why I worked out that 7 hours was my maximum that I could offer companies. The way that I started was that I made a list of incubator spaces because I realized that bigger companies are going to want to hire people that are more established, right? Like not PhD students or like postdocs. They want like somebody who has more experience. So I made a list of incubators. So like in Boston. So at the time there were about 3 or 4. And then I went to their website and they always have like a page that says companies that are being incubated, right? So these are like, I'm sure that you guys have probably spoken to people from these incubators before, but right, these are like startups that are so early stage that they're probably like teams of 5 to 10 people. They don't have a lot of funding, so any help is great. And they're incubating in these buildings. So I'd go and I'd look at the tab that said the companies that were incubating. And then I went through the companies and I made a list of all of the companies that had any overlap with my expertise. And then I went on LinkedIn and I DM'd the founders. And yeah, they were always really flattered by it. Like I would just like DM and be like, I'm an expert. Like one company was actually a food allergy company. And I was like, my focus is food allergies and T cells and the microbiome. I'd love to hear more about what you're working on. And then when I would go and meet them, they would obviously like go into selling mode of like what the company is, because even if they don't want to work with you, you'll still appear in the field because you're an expert in what they're doing. So they're invested in trying to impress you. And so you go and you meet them and they will like show you what they're working on, maybe show you their pitch deck, what their science is. I'd always be polite, even if I didn't necessarily understand the science or like whether there was a valuable business model there, because maybe I was missing something, like I don't have industry experience. So maybe like, even though I was like, the science seems weird, like I'm like, it's not, they obviously have advisory board who can tell them differently. But then if I like the companies, like this food allergy company, I like said to them, I actually want to I might want to move over to industry and I want to get as much experience as possible. Are you guys looking for part-time support? And then the co-founder was like, how many hours? And I was like 7 to 10. And he was like, okay. And I started off by making sales calls for them, just to get sales experience, hated it and decided that I was not good at it. Could not do it. I was really bad at it. I had way too much imposter syndrome and I was too anxious on the phone. And then I started helping with like marketing assets. And then I moved over and I started doing more like clinical trial design for them. And it helped me understand how to do that stuff. But I was just helping them. Like I wasn't really applying my expertise a lot. And I was just trying to understand how companies work. So that's how I got that one. And then after that, I would just ask people in informational interviews if they were in VC. So I consulted for a couple of venture capital funds, because VCs obviously have their associates who go out and then like see where the money should go or what companies they want to invest in. And then there were a couple of VCs who, whenever they had immunology companies or food allergy companies, would reach out and say, hey, can you sit in on this pitch and tell us what you think of the company, like from your perspective? The one side note that I'll put here, because it might not be relevant for everybody, is that I was on a visa which meant that I could not accept money for anything that I was doing outside of my postdoc at the time. I don't know how it works for everybody, but if there's anyone who's wondering how to navigate that, please reach out to me, because I worked out that I didn't have to do voluntary work and that you could actually log your hours and then invoice the companies 3 years in advance whenever you're ready. When your green card's ready or whatever, you can go back and invoice them then, if they're still alive and kicking. The other thing I would say for anyone who wants to reach out separately is how to invoice. Do not do work for free. You do not have to. I learned that the hard way, because a lot of the time, these startups have funding, they have money to be able to pay for you to help them, but they're not going to drive that. So if you're working for them for free, they're going to keep accepting that help. But what you have to be pretty gung-ho about like writing out an invoice and sending them an invoice every time you do the work. And there's no shame in it. It took, again, one of my mentors helped me work out how to do it. And so if anyone's interested in learning more about like invoicing companies, that's something that I'm more than happy to chat about.
Thank you. That was really helpful and a really interesting idea that I hadn't heard of, but it does seem very exciting.
Yeah.
Do you think that was like a valuable use of your time I think you did say that did help you get your first job out of your postdoc, right?
Yeah, it was valuable because at the time I didn't know whether I wanted an early stage startup or whether I wanted Series B, Series C. Do I want a company that's IPO'd? Like, what position is it that I want? And I realized I didn't want an established pharma company because the opportunities for learning would be less, just because things are way more like organized, and like people are more pigeonholed, they have clear job descriptions. I wanted to learn more about the opportunities. And so I realized I wanted an early stage startup, but I didn't, it also, having that experience helped me understand the type of founders that I wanted to work with and the type of people that I could partner with, because some founders are just like, business people, which is excellent because it gives you scientific license to do what you want and they respect that boundary. If you have a co-founder who does too much of what you do, I generally observed that there can be a little bit more of a clash about vision. So it can work. It's just you have to be more explicit early on about what you're looking for so that there's no clashes about the direction of the projects you're working on. But that's what that experience helped me kind of realize is that, again, the jobs I didn't want to do, but also the size of company that I was interested in working with.
I think I have like a similar perspective of that my advisor would not be able to know about like something like that. Did you ever worry that or not contact certain companies, worrying that maybe it would get back to your advisor, that you connected with them, or like
because also because my advisor just didn't know enough about how it all worked that he would know that I was doing regular work for them. Like sometimes that, like it definitely got, like I actually started being direct with him at the end, about 7 months from the end. I definitely was punished for it. I was definitely like, if experiment didn't work, I definitely get the, well, maybe if you weren't so distracted on, you know, and I'm just like, whatever, like get your jab in. But I started to be more clear with him about it at the end. But there was one point where I started to just say, oh yeah, like I know this company. I've spoken to them. And then he would be like, why would you speak to them? And I'm like, because they reached out, because they're working in this, they're doing a project related to like allergies or whatever. And so I chatted to them. Chatted could mean anywhere between like, we grabbed a 2-minute conversation waiting for a bus to, they are paying me regular hours. And I'm just like, I don't need to tell him any more detail that's not really relevant to him. But yeah, I would just say to him, yeah, I know that company. I mean, especially being in Boston, like you could be roommates with someone at that, you know, like they don't know, they're not going to ask you that level of detail, but just be like, yeah, I connected with them. I know them well. Like, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions?
I don't know, since I'm not organizer.
So I guess if there is no other question, thank you. Thanks a lot for your time. It was pretty engaging. It was amazing discussion.
I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you for listening. And I hope I didn't overwhelm people with Excel docs but yeah, I honestly just remember that it is a skill set. It really doesn't come easy to most people. It feels like it does. But it doesn't. It really, really doesn't. Like it takes, even like the most confident people who like to chat a lot, don't find it easy. And so like be kind to yourself through the process. And even if you have like some pretty awful informational interviews or like, you know, like if someone responds badly to something you say, whatever, like you'll learn from it and just like move on to the next thing. Like it's not, everybody goes through this. And so, yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
So much.